Um, Good morning, everybody. Okay, some of you were here last week. I don't think everybody was. We're not going to do a recap of everything. What we did is we gave some background of Sefer Melachim, and we looked at the first part of the first few psukim of Sefer Melachim, which relates the story of David and Avishag, right? And the continuation of that, it goes straight into the story of what is going to be termed Mered Adoniyahu, where Adoniyahu tries to take over and be king. And the way we read it last week is that the first few psukim, 4 psukim, 5 psukim, the story of Avishag is there primarily to underscore the fact that David is no longer kashir, is no longer capable of functioning as a king because he's too old and not with it. And therefore it makes sense, since there's a vacuum there, it makes sense to fill that, try to fill that vacuum. And we also saw that Adoniah was theoretically the next in line for the kingship. So had David died, he probably would have automatically been king anyway. However, we saw that the psukim, the way that the psukim are set out, are the way the narrator relates this story, is very critical of Adoniah. And even though he would have been king anyway, and even though he's next in line, even though there's a vacuum, and even though David is no longer functioning as king, Adoniah is presented as a rebel and not as a legitimate successor to David. We saw, for example, we saw, for example, in this particular slide, we saw how Adoniah is compared to Avshalom in several ways, implying that just like Avshalom was an illegitimate rebel against the king, Adoniah too is considered an illegitimate rebel against the king. Okay, that is, I believe, where we left off last time. Before we continue, any comments, questions, background, something that you need to fill in? For those of you who were never in my class before, this is a class where I really, really, really want people to participate and talk, because I can't talk for so long. And nobody wants to hear me talk for an hour and a bit. So feel free to pipe up whenever. Don't wait for me to ask. Okay, just say whatever you want to say, comment, question, complain, whatever. Okay, good. So that is as far as we got. We got as far as Adoniah ben Chagit, who mitnaseh, like he's elevating himself. He's very, high and elevates himself, which Tanakh never considers a good thing. Ga'ava is considered one of the top no-nos in Tanakh. To say a nimloch, like he wants to place himself as king. And we had this little bracketed comment by the narrator, V'lo atzavo aviv miyamav. His father never stopped him. You get the impression that he's a spoiled child, just like Avshalom was, because he's so beautiful, because whatever. And perhaps also because, and this is going to come up a little bit later, in the history, the way it's presented in Sefer Shmuel, and I think, I may be going out on a limb here, but I think Sefer Shmuel is not necessarily related chronologically. We have the first part of Sefer Shmuel, which is Shaul, and yet the second part of Shmuel, in Shmuel Bet, tells the stories of David. And in both cases, in both the case of Shaul and the case of David, it starts off with the king, Shaul or David, being great, successful, God-fearing, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. In both cases, you have a cardinal sin that they did. In Shaul's case, it was the case of not killing off Amalek like he was commanded to do. In David's case, it was Chet Batsheva. And after that, you have kind of a decline from then on of both Shaul and David in the later days. I am not convinced that all the stories are presented chronologically. I think that it's more of an agenda-based editing of the book. By editing, I mean by Shmuel, Hanavi, and Natan and Gad, who wrote the book of Shmuel. to show us that as long as they were God-fearing and did everything they were supposed to do, everything went well. Once they messed up, then things went downhill. That may or may not be true, but the way it's presented in Sefer Shmuel, once David sins with Bathsheba, and that whole issue, after that, there are many things that happen in David's household, be it Amnon and Avshalom and Tamar and a whole bunch of other stories where David is presented as mostly passive. He's still king, he still goes to fight his wars, he still does these things, but as far as his family is concerned, he's presented as passive, okay? And that may have something to do with our case also, because here he is, he's dying, he's pretty much incompetent as king, but he's not actively appointing a successor. He's kind of letting things fall into place on its own. And Adoniah seems to be taking advantage of that and say, okay, let's not wait for the king to die. I'm going to do it now, which is always not legitimate, because you cannot have two kings at the same time, right? Like one king is only king after the other king is gone, right? The king is dead, long live the king. If you have a king who takes over when another king is still alive, it's a coup, it's a rebellion. It's you're going to have to kill off the previous king and all the other contenders. Okay, so it's presented as a not good thing. Beseder. And here is what Adoniah does. Vayizbach Adoniah tzon uvakar umari. So Adoniah brings these korbanot. Im even hazochelet asher etzel ein rogel. This is just a geographical mention. He does this in a place, a source of water, ein, right, Ma'ayan, so some sort of source of water that is outside of the borders of Yerushalayim. So he finds this spot, and that is where he does his thing. Vayikra et kol echav b'nei hamelech, and he calls all of his brothers, the king's sons, ulechol anshe Yehuda avdei hamelech, and to all the people of Yehuda, the servants of the king. Ve'et Natan hanavi uvnayahu. Nayahu was a military leader of David at the time. Ve'et hagiburim, the other, the sayeret, right? David's personal military, right? The king's guard. Ve'et Shlomo achiv, alone among the other bnei hamelech, lo kara. All right, so here we have a definition of or description of Adoniah's of both sides of this upcoming conflict between the faction, let's call it that, of Adoniah and that of David, right? And here's where it splits. We have on Adoniah's side Adoniah, who wants to be king, and we have David, who is king, right? As far as family is concerned, we have on Adoniah's side all of the king's sons, which means the entire royal family, except for Shlomo, who he didn't call. So that would put Shlomo on the king's side, on David's side. As far as military personnel, we're going to see, not here, but we're going to see later that he has Yoav. Yoav is a Sar Tzava, he's the general. And on David's side, we have Benayahu. Okay. The interesting thing, we have that there's one glaring difference between Adoniah's people and David's people, which I'm leaving up to you to find right now.
Is it made up entirely of Yehuda?
Okay. Anything else? David's side has a Navi. Right? Avshalom's Adoniah's side does not have a Navi. And if you make you'll often see like a table of who are the sides. It's very glaring that you have family and you have political and you have all the different types of officials and people represented in both parties, except for Navi. Navi we only have on David's side. And this is important, perhaps for two reasons. One is maybe Adoniah didn't care and didn't need a Navi on his side. Navi is here representative of God's legitimation, okay? Because if you have a Navi on your side, a true Navi, right, that means that God is on your side. He does not have that, or he does not seek that. The flip side of that may be that he would not get that, okay? Maybe he wanted and he didn't get it, okay? So either he doesn't want it, he doesn't care about what God has to say about his appointment, or he does, but God is not okay with his appointment. So in any case, I think that's kind of that's what we could see from having Natan on one side, not the other. Yes, Esther, you don't have to raise your hand because I don't see it. Just talk.
Why didn't he invite David if he was the next in line anyway? Why and invited everyone else? Why did he exclude Shlomo from the invitation? Was he sensing
Also,
something?
makes it sound. Go on.
No, I'm saying, was he sensing something? Was he? I mean, why Shlomo?
Well, why Dafka, not Shlomo? You're saying?
Yes.
Well, I guess that Shlomo was the person after him. Maybe there was sense, maybe there was talk, and we're going to see soon a hint of that. Okay, and a few more slides, we're going to see a hint of why maybe Shlomo, but just the fact that he's not doing it in the palace or in Jerusalem or with everybody, like, why does he have to go out of Yerushalayim and make his own little private party? Already suggests that he realizes that it's not totally kosher, right? He's trying to chop a coup here, at the expense of people who may not be so happy with this appointment. Because if it was totally legitimate and all okay, he should have gone to David and say, make me king, or I don't know, wait until David dies. The fact that he's kind of doing this in a mechtaf, he's doing this under the radar, with only his little entourage already, I think, expresses that not only Tanakh considers this to be illegitimate, he also realizes there's something wrong about this. And why Shlomo specifically is a good question, and maybe we're going to get an answer to that in a minute. I just want to look at two things here. First of all, we have Avdei HaMelech. Avdei HaMelech are the people who are closest to David, right? These are David's slaves, servants, whatever. David's people. And the reason the phrase Avdei HaMelech may be so important, and I'm going to make you a little bit dizzy now by going back, and I apologize about that. Apologize for that, but here we go. The story at the beginning that we saw of Avishag, right? David could not be warmed, and therefore the Avdei HaVadavia said, Yivakshu Adoni HaMelech, somebody who will keep you warm, and Vivakshu na'ara yafa b'chol gvul Yisrael, right? And they bring her to David. Who are the people who make this suggestion and who carry it out, this finding of Abishag?
Avadav.
Avadav, okay, which makes it sound like it's the same people the same Avadim, who later are on Avshalom's side. I keep saying Avshalom, on Adoniyahu's side, right? The same Avadim. If you look further, we didn't say this last time, but we have Vivakshu na'ara yafa bechol gevul Yisrael. They're looking for, the fact that they're looking for a na'ara, a young woman to keep David warm, maybe we could say, okay, that makes sense. I don't know, biologically or whatever. The fact that she should be Betula makes sense because she's going to be with the king. The fact that she should be Yafa perhaps also makes sense because, we're bringing this girl to the king. He might as well have a beautiful girl. What's the deal with Bechol Gevul Yisrael? That made sense perhaps. We compare this to Achashverosh, right? But here, could they not have found a Na'ara Yafa Betula, I don't know, somewhere in Yerushalayim, or maybe expand it a little bit and say, Yehuda, what happens when you look for a Na'ara for this particular job, Bechol Gvul Yisrael? What do people think? I'm thinking maybe, when people in, I don't know, Afula hear that they're looking for such a girl for such a job, it kind of publicizes throughout the entire kingdom that David is no longer competent. Okay, it's not a private matter looking for something to help David specifically. This turns into a huge PR campaign that says, hey, look, David can't handle anything anymore, so we have to find somebody. Anybody out there? Anybody? It kind of publicizes that, and that fits well with if we identify these avadim with the avadim who later follow Adoniyahu, right? We have in that case we have a case of it seems like they had David's best interests in mind and they're trying to help him out, but they're doing it in such a way, I think, as to undermine him, right? To emphasize he is really not worthy anymore of being a king, and these same avadim are the ones who later on go with Adoniyahu.
So why would Adoniyahu have the king publicly proclaim him? Why didn't he go and ask him? It says he liked him very much. He never.
Again, that would all point, right? If he's not competent and David obviously, likes the spoiled child, et cetera, it would make the most sense for him to go to David and say explicitly, make me king. The fact that he didn't points to the fact that even he realizes that it's not legitimate. You don't become a king unless the previous king dies. In our case, we also mentioned last time that this is the first time in Israelite history that we have the beginning of a monarchy dynasty, right? It's going to eventually become rote that when the king dies, you wait until the king dies or is killed in Mamlechet Yehuda. That's where the legitimate dynasty of kings is. And as soon as the king dies, then his son will automatically replace him. Which son? Throughout the rest of Sefer Melachim, we do not seem to have a problem. There's no like your medieval European history. There's no fight among the brothers that one brother kills all the rest of the brothers, etc. We don't have that. Maybe it's the oldest son. Maybe there's some other mechanism for determining, but it's a kind of natural thing. The king dies, and here we're setting that precedent. Here, for the first time, we're setting up the institution of dynasty, and right now he is trying to, swoop in and do it before it's time. Now you may say it's not before it's time, right? David is ready to die, but David is not dead yet. Okay, and as long as David is not dead, it is illegitimate to try to replace him. It's considered a rebellion to try to take the king's place in the king's lifetime, even if the king is not very active at the moment. The reason
I'm sorry. As of yet, we have not heard any protestation against what he's doing.
No, none. That's going to come soon. Okay, first he has to do it, and then people could protest it. So we're about to get the protest. Okay, the protest is going to come, like, as you know, from Natan and Bathsheba, or specifically from Natan, because Natan is God's voice who says, no, this is not what is supposed to happen. So
which is why it's questionable why he did not invite Natan to begin with.
Of course, because he knew that Natan is not going to be on his side, or he sensed that Natan is not going to be on his side. But he was trying to establish a de facto fact, right? Here I am king. All these people are for me. I proclaim myself king. Long live King Adoniyahu. And then what?
Why does he think he's going to win?
Because he has all of Echav Bnei HaMelech and all of Anshe Yehuda of Dei HaMelech and Yoav behind him, supporting him. David's faction at this point seems very weak. I mean, he has the upper hand of being the current king, but it seems like all the people, or all these strong people, are with Adoniyahu.
I don't know. Having the Navi on your side seems to me to be the biggest plus, which he does not.
Because that's because you're a good from Jew. But if you're assuming that the biggest plus is having numbers and armies on your side, then it doesn't matter that you don't have a Navi.
Okay.
I mean, for us as readers, that is another point against him, right? But as far as he's concerned, what does he care about the Navi?
Okay.
But the fact that the reason I brought up this whole section is because I think there's maybe two ways to look at Adoniyahu's upcoming revolt, okay, or current revolt. One is political. Right. One is political in that he's just trying to take over, and he's doing it by force, and he's doing it by multitudes and de facto and whatever. The other way to look at it is from the religious perspective or the theological perspective. Okay, and if we're looking for the theological perspective, he does not have a Navi on his side. We did not yet hear what the Navi has to say, and we do not yet know what it is that, like, why is this not legitimate? Okay, what God thinks about this. And how does this reflect on David? Maybe this is yet another in the long line. We don't know that David has any designs for Shlomo. Maybe this is just another in the long line of punishments that David had to undergo after Chet Batsheva. Okay, he's going to have his son forcefully replace him, remove him forcefully from the throne, and maybe this is just David has to say, so be it. I deserve this. Okay. One more thing about this. We hear here, this is the narrator telling us what it is that Adoniyahu did, right? He did the zevach and he called this and he didn't call that. This is the narrator speaking, and the narrator's voice, as we know, is reliable. Okay, he may not be telling us everything, but we can trust what it is that he tells us. This is going to be the first of a fourfold repetition of this story. Okay, we're going to have other people describe what Adoniyahu did, and that's going to be important because whenever we have a repetition in Tanakh, it invites us to compare the subjective take of the other speakers to the objective description of the narrator. Okay, so here we have a description. This is what happened. Okay, and now we're going to see the first retelling of this story of what happened. And that is Natan. Okay, we're coming back to the Navi, and now we hear the Navi's voice, what he has to say about this. Vayomer Natan el Batsheva, em Shlomo. We don't yet know why he turns to Batsheva and why specifically Shlomo, but he tells her like this: Halo shamat ki malach Adoniyahu ben Chagit. You probably heard already that Adoniyahu ben Chagit has become king. That's already, I think, a little bit of a discrepancy from the narrator's description, right? The narrator said that Adoniyahu said, "I will be king," and he did all these things. He didn't proclaim himself king yet. Nobody proclaimed himself. They're doing this ceremony, right? But it's not a done deal. He's presenting it as if a done deal. Va'adonenu David lo yada. You have an interesting wordplay here between Adoniyahu and Adonenu, perhaps, right? On the one hand, you have Adoniyahu is king. On the other hand, our Adon, our master David, didn't know. We mentioned last time that not knowing is not knowing physically and not knowing mentally. It's a sign of being detached from reality, incompetent. Okay, he didn't know. Va'ata, and now says Natan, Lechi iatzach na itza. I'm going to give you an eitzah. I'm going to give you advice. Yeah, thank you. Umalti et nafshech ve'et nefesh b'nech Shlomo. And you will save your life and your son Shlomo's life. Why do their lives need to be saved?
From Adoniyahu,
Why?
because he wants to take control.
Okay, and if he takes control, he's going to have to get rid of anybody who might be a legitimate contender, right? He's not going to kill the kitchen staff. He's not going to kill, I don't know, his sister. He's going to kill anybody else might say, wait a minute, that's a legitimate king and not you. Okay, so again, going back to medieval European history, if anybody knows European medieval history, anytime a new king was appointed, even if it's a legitimate son of the previous king, the first thing he does is kill off all his brothers. Okay, so no, or male cousins or anybody. So nobody's going to say that there may be somebody else out there. So if Adoniyahu becomes king, this now puts Shlomo as a potential king, and he said, well, this is going to be an issue, and I'm giving you advice now on how to save your life and your son Shlomo's life. And what does he suggest to do? He suggests to confront David HaMelech. Lechi uvoy el HaMelech David. Go to the king, va'amart elav, and say to him, quote, he's putting words in her mouth, Halo ata Adoni HaMelech nishbata la'amatcha lemor. You, my lord the king, you had sworn, given an oath to me, your maidservant, Batsheva, and you said, Ki Shlomo b'nech yimloch acharai v'hu yishev al kis'i, that Shlomo, your son, meaning Bathsheba's son, is going to be king after me. This is right. This is Natan telling Bathsheba to quote David. He's going to sit on my throne. In other words, he's going to be king next. Umadua malach Adoniyahu, right? She's confronting me, saying, listen, you swore to me that my son Shlomo is going to be the king. How come Adoniyahu is the king? Okay, that's a confrontation. And Natan is completing his plan and telling her, and while you're there speaking with the king, I'm going to come in and I'm going to take it up where you left off, and it's going to be kind of, we're going to gang up on the king. Okay, so the plan is to tell David, this is not right. First of all, obviously everybody knows that Adoniyahu is king, right? But how can he be king when you swore to me that Shlomo is going to be king? Okay, the main problem with this is that
Well, David probably never made that.
we
David probably never said that.
don't know. Okay, we don't know.
But why would he have said that if he was going in straight lines of succession? He would not have
Okay.
said that.
So either he never said that, and if he never said that, then perhaps she is playing, or they are playing on his senility,
Right.
right? And making up something and kind of gaslighting him or convincing him that this is something he said. Or
Right.
maybe this is something that he had said, and it's just not recorded anywhere for our benefit. And Sefer Shmuel, we don't hear of this oath, okay? But so either they're inventing an oath, or they're coming up with they're recording an oath that we're not privy to, okay? But keep that in mind. This is Natan's plan. Yeah.
But why would the Navi lie? Does the Navi lie generally?
Well, first of all, sometimes. Another option with Shamash Farshim bring up is that it was an oath between David and Bathsheba. Because he's a Navi, he happened to know about it, right? But it was not information that was out there for anybody else to know about. In other words, as far as everybody else was concerned, Adoniyahu was the next person in line. David and Bathsheba and Natan being a Navi were the only people who were privy to this information. So Mefarshim who are going to go that way are the ones who are going the way you're going and saying, well, of course, a Navi doesn't lie.
What about a theological explanation?
Sorry?
Is there a theological explanation why the Navi, like with Yaakov and Rivka, that he's
Right. So we're going to come up to the theological, the Gemaras are, we're going to see stuff. Okay. We're going to get into the David and Bathsheba oath in a few slides. I just want to say, Cheryl, the other option is that you can kind of apologetically say, well, this is not a lie. It's a plan, right? He's not saying that David made an oath. He's telling Bathsheba to claim that there's an oath. I don't know if we're happy with that either.
I think that is just interesting that he chooses the route of Bathsheba. I mean, because I think usually the woman is not the political,
Yeah, okay. So why is it that the bottom line is Natana, for whatever prophetic reasons or personal reasons, but let's call it prophetic reasons at the moment, needs to ensure that Shlomo and not Adoniyahu become the next king? Why is his best plan of action to go through the aging and mostly ignored female Bathsheba, who is like, I don't know what her standing is in court, but right now her standing is certainly not close enough. He has Abishag right now in his arms, right? Bathsheba has to come in, right? So she's an outsider, at least to David's current status. And like you said, she's a woman and she's old. And I don't know when the last time David spoke to her is. Why is it that she is the most obvious route for trying to topple this plan of Adoniyahu's?
Well, Shlomo was a little kid, apparently, and she was his mom.
Yeah, not clear that he was a little kid.
Uh-huh.
He's described later as youthful, but youthful may be inexperienced. Okay. And even if he's a kid, there's a big difference between 10 and 15 and 20.
And the other thing is,
sorry?
I was wondering if there's something ironic in the fact with Natan's previous interaction with Bathsheba, the sin and everything, and now he comes to her
Give me a few more slides, we'll get to that.
Okay.
Great.
Is
Yep.
is Bathsheba maybe almost like a weakness? So to play off that.
Well, she's presenting it as, he's telling her to throw it on this oath, right? Which presents not so much Bathsheba's weakness, I think, as David. You didn't fulfill your oath, right? But I want to get to the Bathsheba thing again. These are all excellent comments. I want to get to that in a few more slides. I just want to point out while we're reading this to note that Shlomo, who is the focus of this whole enterprise, is totally passive in this whole chapter. He doesn't do anything or say anything. People are working on his behalf. In other words, Natan didn't turn to Shlomo and say, Shlomo, why don't you go to your father and say, you promised me that I'm going to be king, right? This doesn't happen. It goes through Bathsheba, and I think Sarina has a point. I'm pointing out that there may be something specific about Bathsheba. Give me a few more slides, we'll get to it, okay? So this is the second retelling of the story. The third retelling of the story is when Bathsheba comes to David, as per Natan's plan, and she reports this business of Adoniyahu. And she says like this, V'tavo Bathsheba el hamelech hachadra. She comes to his chambers. V'hamelech zaken me'od. If we needed any reminder about his state, he is very old. V'avishag hashunamit misharat et hamelech. And Avishag is there ministering to the king. Avishag is there, not Bathsheba doing this ministering. We have no reason to think that there's any favoritism towards Bathsheba. She has to come in, right? It's also, if you want to go flashback to that scene, right? Back then, David, when Bathsheba was young, right? David could not keep away from Bathsheba. And now Bathsheba, through the, her memory or whatever, she sees this young woman who's now kind of being in her stead here. But tikod Bathsheba v'tishtach l'melech, she bows down to the king. Bathsheba, v'yomer hamelech ma'lach. Ma'lach, what's up? Are the first two words that David says in this story. And they're not very.
Sounds so much like Achashverosh
Yep.
and Esther.
There's a lot, right? We had, so last time the whole business of bringing the Na'ara Betula was also very much Achashverosh. Except we saw last time that the big difference between Achashverosh and David is that Achashverosh seemed to be much more involved and proactive and commanding of the situation, whereas David is kind of letting everything happen to him. So Malach kind of sounds like he's surprised, like, what are you doing here? Right? So she's obviously not someone who often comes in for a chat. V'tomer lo Adoni, she says to him, my lord, Ata nishbata b'Hashem Elohecha lamatecha, ki Shlomo v'nech yimloch acharai v'hu yishev al kisi. How does that compare with what Natan told her to say? You have sworn an oath in the name of God to your maidservant that my son Shlomo will be the next king and he will sit on my throne.
But she says that he swore by Hashem Elokecha.
Yeah, okay. She's adding that, okay? So if in Natan's plan, the guilt factor is toward Bathsheba, you swore an oath to me, how can you possibly, renege on that oath that you swore to me? She's adding another layer. She's saying, never mind, you swore an oath to me. Yeah, you swore an oath to me, but you did in God's name. You certainly, like we know, there's no way you can go back on an oath taken in God's name. And she brings the story, which we'll see in a second, what it is that Adoniah is doing. That's the third retelling of the story. I want to look now, go back to all those things that you said before about Bathsheba, okay? And let's start with this Nishbata b'Hashem Elohecha, okay? Let's look at what Malbim has to say about this pasuk that she says. Malbim says like this, Ata nishbata, you swore, Shaita shvua b'Hashem Elohecha, shehi shvua chamura b'Hashem. Not only you swore, but you swore in the name of God, which is a very strict oath. Ubefrat lema shenemar shanishba b'Elohei Yisrael en metirino. There's no way to take back an oath taken in God's name. You swore it la'amatecha. You swore it to your maidservant. And Malbim adds, "Vanishba l'chavero en metirim lo ela lefanav." If you swear an oath to somebody, you can only go back on that oath when they're around, right, to their face, and she wasn't around when Adoniyahu did whatever it is that he did. She'amarta, and what was this oath? Ki Shlomo bnech yimloch acharai. Malbim says like this: Shimloch mitzad shu bni, he's my son, right? That's why he should be the king next. Me'ahavatcha oti, because you, David, love me, Batsheva. V'chi ani hareuya lezeh. Mitzad sheyitzeh mimi'i shivtai mushlim. And I'm deserving, says Batsheva, I'm deserving of the fact that the king should come out of my lineage. Befrat lema she'amru chachamenu zichronah livracha shelo ratzta linaseh lo rak al t'nai zeh. Okay, we're going to see that in a minute, but he's mentioning Malbim, a midrash or a gemara or a chazal, whatever, that according to that, back then, when David asked Bathsheba to marry him, right after the first incident, she only agreed to marry him on the condition that her son will be the next king. Okay, so that is why she married him in the first place. And that's why this whole marriage came about. And he, Shlomo, will sit on my throne. Not only because of the Bathsheba is worthy of being the mother of a king, and not only because of the oath, and not only because it's only only because of that David married Bathsheba, but also because Shlomo himself is worthy. Because his rule is going to be like yours. Your kingdom, your rule is not going to be any the lesser for having Shlomo take over. Okay. Now I want to talk a minute about this oath, right? Everybody's assuming that there was such an oath. Malbim is assuming that this was not only an oath, after Shlomo was born or at some point, but this oath preceded and was the condition for the marriage of David and Bathsheba, that she only married him on condition that her son will be king. So I want to talk about this oath for a minute. Like we said, we do not have any mention of it in Sefer Shmuel. We do have a hint of it in Divrei Hayamim, and again, it is not clear, we'll see, whether this was historically true that there was such an oath, or whether David here or elsewhere decided that yes, oh yeah, I probably did make such an oath, and then he's retelling. Let's look at the stories in Divrei Hayamim. Divrei Hayamim, this is the section where David is handing over his kingdom to Shlomo, which is going to happen by us in Perek Bet, okay? After David pulls himself together and becomes more of a person, right? He talks to Shlomo and he gives him his will and testament. And among other things, he tells Shlomo, Vayomer David l'Shlomo, b'ni, l'Shlomo b'no, or b'ni, ani haya im levavi livnot bait l'shem Hashem Elohai. I wanted to build Beit HaMikdash, says David. Okay, and if you remember, the story about David wanting to build Beit HaMikdash came after the sin with Bathsheba, and he told Natan, I want to build a Beit HaMikdash, and Natan, in a prophetic voice, said, you can't, but your son will. And God had told me, Dam larov shafachta umilchamot gedelot asita, because you have spilled much blood and made many wars. Lo tivne bait lishmi ki damim rabim shafachta arta lafanai. Many of us have heard that the reason that David didn't build the Beit HaMikdash is because you can't build a Mikdash with can't build Beit HaMikdash with so much blood on your hands. That comes from here. We don't have anywhere that a Navi told David that specific reason. In Shmuel, when Natan Navi tells David, you will not build a Beit, he does not bring this reason. Okay, he does not bring any reason. He just says, no, but your son will. David is saying this, again, we don't know, either because there was such a prophetic voice that told him this, or because this is David's own assumption. But he's continuing with what he claims was told to him. Hinei ben nolad lach, you're going to have a son. Hu yeh ish menucha, v'anichoti lo mikol oivav b'sav. He's going to be a man of peace and quiet, and he will have no enemies. Ki Shlomo yeh shmo, his name is going to be Shlomo. In other words, got this message before Shlomo was born. V'shalom v'sheket eten al Yisrael b'yamav, and I will give peace to Israel during his days. He's going to build this Beit HaMikdash, etc. So from here, from this theoretical prophetic voice, again, that we have no other account of, David is telling Shlomo, when I wanted to build Beit HaMikdash way back then, God told me that you, David, cannot build him, but you're going to have a son, and his name is going to be Shlomo, and he's going to be king after you, and he's going to build Beit HaMikdash. Okay, so maybe there was. This may hint to the fact that there was this assumption or prophetic assumption, or David assumed, or everybody assumed that Shlomo is going to be the next king. Okay. The other thing is that this legitimizes perhaps the otherwise questionable lineage of Bathsheba, son of Bathsheba. Okay, we know that Bathsheba and David was Bathsheba was David's biggest sin, right? And the first child they had together because of that sin died, and then he married her legitimately, and then they had Shlomo. That seems to be a little bit less legitimate from the other queens that he had and the other children he had. And maybe somebody someday is going to say, of all your children, this is the one that you picked, the woman that you raped and eventually had to give it. This maybe legitimizes when you say, well, God had foretold the birth of this son, and he's going to be king after you, and he's going to build the Beit HaMikdash. Which raises the question, and this I'm going back to I don't know who said this before, maybe Tali. What was David cleared of this sin of Bathsheba? And I want to say, and here I'm certainly connecting to Serena, who mentioned the similarities. If you look at the story back then of Chet David and Bathsheba, and compare it, just the framework of that to what's going on now. First of all, it's the only two stories that we have in Tanakh that involve the three characters of David, Bathsheba, and Natan. So just that fact may encourage us to say, wait a minute, the fact that Natan, in this case, is turning specifically to Bathsheba about the case of Shlomo, to David, bringing those three characters together, and he's not turning to anybody else. The fact that he's bringing these three characters together may invite us to compare or to have a throwback to that original scene, okay, with the three of them when David is rebuking David. The second thing, within our story, when they first suggest to David that he take this woman to keep him warm, the words are v'shachva b'cheikecha, she shall sleep in your arms.
Oh, that's like the lamb.
That is like the lamb, right? When Natan comes to David with mashal kivsat harash, the lamb mashal, right, to try to show David how he had sinned. The lamb, which in that story presumably represents Bathsheba, right, is described as uvecheiko tishkav. This man who owned this lamb that would sleep with this lamb, right? The lamb would sleep with the man, like as a close companion. The words are very similar. V'shachva b'cheikecha uvecheiko tishkav, right? So there's another connection between the two stories. Here we have, there we had the young David who could not resist Bathsheba. Now we have the old David now who can't even have relations with this young, beautiful virgin who is in his bed. Okay, so that kind of gives the contrast of David. And Radak on our pasuk says like this about the oath. V'lama nishbala? Why did David make this oath to the Bathsheba? Amru chachamim. Kikshemet, and this is what Malbim was referring to. Kikshemet hayelad, when their first child, the child of the rape, was born. Oh, it was died. The first child. Amra Bathsheba said, hayelad met mipnei avon. The child died because of the sin. Afilu yeli mimcha ben shel kayama. Even if I ever have a son with you, David, who will live, yavuzu oto echav. His brothers will scorn him. Mipnei shebati elecha be'avon mitchila. Because originally I came to you within the context of sin. So he will not be accepted as the legitimate son of the king. V'lo ratzta li zakek, and she refused to sleep with him or to marry him. Ad shenishbala, until he swore to her, ki haben sheyeh lo mimena rishona imloch acharav. Okay, so this we have Radak bringing up a Chazal's suggestion as to where this oath came from, right? Again, we don't know if Natan is making up this oath, or we don't like the fact that he's making up this oath. So we're assuming that there was such an oath. Why would there ever be such an oath? And they're bringing it as a reason why Bathsheba married David in the first place, in order to preempt the situation and legitimize her son. Not only will they consider him legitimate, they will consider him legitimate enough to be king, because David already, before the son is ever born, before she even marries him, swore to her that her son will be the king. One more slide on this. Okay? You could read the English. I'm going to try to translate. Amar David lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. David says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono shel olam, mechol li al oto avon. Please forgive me for that sin, again referring to the sin with Bathsheba. Amar lo machulach, and God said, you are forgiven. Amar lo, David said to God, aseh imi ot b'chayai, give me some sort of sign while I am still alive that I will know that I was forgiven. Amar lo, and Kadosh Baruch Hu said to David, b'chayecha eini modia, I'm not going to give you such a sign in your lifetime. B'chayei Shlomo bincha ani modia, but I will give such a sign in the lifetime of your son Shlomo. How does this sign come about? Fast forward. Kshebana Shlomo et Beit HaMikdash, when Shlomo built the Beit HaMikdash, bikesh lachnis Aron lebeit kodshei hakodashim. He wanted to bring the Aron HaBrit into the Beit HaMikdash, to the Kodesh Kodshim. Davku she'arim ze bazeh. And the gates of Beit HaMikdash got stuck together and refused to open. Amar Shlomo esrim ve'arba renanot. Shlomo said 24 hymns. Velo na'ana, and I skipped the whole part. He tried this in lo na'ana. He tried this, and he was not. There was no response. The gates did not budge, no matter what he did. And at some point, he said, "Hashem Elohim, God, al tashev pnei mashichecha zachra lechazdei David avdecha." God, Shlomo turned to God and said, in paraphrase, help me by the zchut of David HaMelech. Miyad na'ana, and immediately he was answered. And the gates opened, and he was able to bring in the Aron. V'otasha, at that time, yadu kol ha'am v'chol Yisrael, all the people and all of Israel knew Shemachal HaKadosh Baruch Hu al oto avon, that David was forgiven for that sin. Okay, he was forgiven for that sin because here we have his son who is a king. How do we know this son king is legitimate? Because this son mentioning his father were the only thing that was able to open Beit HaMikdash, which is God's sign of approval for the whole enterprise. Okay. Does that help, or does that?
Sorry, where's this source from? Is the Radak continued?
It's a Radak. This is from Shabbat Lamed Amud Aleph.
The thing is, if Shlomo was in fact predestined to be the king, why didn't all the other brothers know about it?
Maybe they did. I don't know. We don't hear anything. We don't hear that. Okay. Everything that we don't hear explicitly in Tanakh is either not important or is very important, but we can learn it from what is there, or is very important and we have to conjecture it. But if we conjecture it, we may be wrong.
Or it could be that they just didn't know yet, like Yosef and his brothers. They did not know at the beginning that Yosef will rule, but eventually with his dreams and everything that happens afterwards, they realized that he was the one that was destined to be.
Oh, well, here they obviously knew it at the end. The question is if anybody else, first of all, if there was such an oath, and second of all, if there was such an oath, then anybody knew it except for David, Bathsheba, and Natan. And that's a question that we can't really answer. But we do know that David, at the time that Adoniah was doing his thing, seemed to be totally passive and not doing anything about it.
And how about when Absalom tried to do stuff?
What?
When Absalom tried to usurp him. I mean,
Absalom tried to usurp it too. That was earlier. That was not as
right.
That was not as a succession. Here Adoniah was doing it as setting up a dynasty, as being David's successor. When Absalom did it, he was trying to replace David, not succeed him. He wanted to kill him and take over the throne, as if he wasn't his son, right? I think that's a little bit different than here. Okay, I want to see how Bathsheba frames what Avshalom, I keep saying Avshalom, what Adoniyahu did. She says like this: Vata hine Adoniya malach. Okay, Adoniya is king, despite the fact that you swore in God's name that Shlomo is going to be king.
Wait, where are you reading?
I'm going back to the psukim in Melachim. Sorry.
Okay.
The same, we saw this before. But I'm continuing these psukim that we were reading before.
Okay.
Okay. Right? You don't even know what's going on. What did he do? And now she's setting out the coalition. She's telling him, he has a Kohen on his side. Well, Yoav Sarat Tzava, he has a general on his side. It doesn't matter right now to Bathsheba that Natan is not on the side. It doesn't matter that anybody else. The only person that she cares about that is excluded is Shlomo. But the Shlomo Avdecha lo kara. Okay, she's pointing out to him, listen, he has all the big shots on his side, but not Shlomo. V'ata Adoni HaMelech, Einei kol Yisrael elecha. She's turning to him as if he's not a wretched Nebuch. You are the king, and all of Israel is looking up to you. Okay, this is a little bit of perhaps flattery, saying you still have, you can do something about this. La'agid lahem mi yishev al kisei Adoni HaMelech acharav. She's not telling him what to do. She's saying, but listen, you have the power. You get to decide, obviously, who is going to be king after you. The implication perhaps is Shlomo, but explicitly it's well, whatever you decide, just decide. Don't let it being decided for you. You don't know what's going on. When you eventually are going to die, but realize that when you die, if you leave this situation unattended, my son Shlomo and myself, we're going to be considered sinners, or in other words, they're going to kill us. Okay? So she doesn't so much confront him as Natan wanted to say. How come you said? And she's saying, listen, there was this oath, right? You swore to him, and this is what's happening now. Deal with that as you wish, but just realize that this is a very pressing issue because it's happening as we speak, and it's going to have implications. And here we have the fourth telling. Now Natan, first we had the narrator, then we had Natan telling Bathsheba, and then we have Bathsheba telling David, and now we have Natan telling David.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you know of to suggest why Yoav sided with Adoniah?
Yoav has been, good question. Yoav was very, very loyal to David throughout David's reign, right?
Right.
Totally, like he was his right-hand man, but he also, there were plenty it's so hard not to bring this into current events, right?
Yeah.
And look at Netanyahu and Gallant.
Mhm.
Yoav was very, very loyal to David and did everything David told him to, except he was also a harsh critic. And at many junctures in David's career, Yoav stood up to him, right, and said, you're being too soft on this, or you're being wrong about that. So even though he acted on David's behalf, he was a political ally, not enemy, political
Dissident.
Okay, let's call it dissident. Okay, politically, he was a liability to David. Okay, and I think if Yoav at this point thought either for his own career, or if I want to give him the benefit of the doubt for Israel's future, that it is important that David right now step down and somebody else step up, and he doesn't know about the oath, or he doesn't care about the oath because Shlomo is a kid and inexperienced, and Adoniyahu obviously knows what he's doing. He may think it's in everybody's best interest, again, either his own or everybody else's, that Adoniyahu be king, and so he's going to shift his loyalty. I think that is very, that would be very characteristic of somebody, of a character like Yoav.
Okay.
Okay.
just as an aside, I'm thinking of the name Shlomo, like
Mhm.
just letters of the word.
Mhm.
You get Shalem, you
Mhm.
get Shalom, and it just hints to that he is the intended contendant.
Well, he's the peaceful one. Although
And
you can't totally discredit Adoniah, who says, well, my Lord is God. God is my Lord. Adoniah.
But you have the Shalem.
You have
Like
Shalem.
Just
Right. Well,
inside.
that's what we saw in Divrei Yamim when David quotes God as saying, you will have a son, his name is Shlomo b'yamav v'ten shalom. Right.
Mhm.
The name there is explained. Yes.
Mhm.
V'inei oda medaberet im hamelech, as she's speaking, v'natan hanavi ba. If you want to get to continue with your with the Megillat Esther, right? We also have Od Ze Medaber V'Ze Ba, right? When as Chashverosh is talking, the Haman comes in, right? You have all these. V'yagidu lamelech lemor, hinei natan hanavi, and they announce him. V'yavo lifnei hamelech v'yishtachu lamelech alapav arza, right? And he comes in and he bows down. V'yomer Natan, Adoni hamelech. Ata amarta Adoniyahu imloch acharai, v'hu yishev al kis'i. Now this is interesting because we know that it's dangerous to put question marks or right in Tanakh. The classic example that everybody always brings, lo tirtzach, lo tinaf, why not, right? And if you put a question mark on some sort of statement, you kind of change the meaning. And here, if we look at this, what he's saying here, you can read it in two ways. One way is saying it's with a question mark, right? Natan came and said, my Lord King, did you say that Adoniah will be king after you and he will sit on your throne? Really? You did that? The other way to say is he's saying, oh, I'm just stating a fact. You, king, you said that Adoniah is going to be king after me and he's going to sit on my throne. Right, so the first way, if you read it with a question mark, it's perhaps challenging David, saying, "Really, that's what you did, or is it true?" I just want to know, right? Information. And if you're saying it without a question mark, he may be challenging David to refute him, right? You said so and so, and David is supposed to say, "No, I didn't," right? In any case, David is being backed into a corner with this information, right? Because this information is no longer being presented as just something of Adoniah's initiative. It's being presented as something that was preempted by David's say-so, right? David said Adoniah is going to be the next king. Vayomer Natan, sorry, Ki Yarad Hayom, and now he's explaining, how do I know this? V'yizbach shor umri v'tzon larov, right? He did all these korbanot, v'yikra l'kol b'nei hamelech, v'l'sarei hatzavah, he called all the king's sons, and he called the heads of the army, and he called the kohen, V'hinam ochlim v'shotim lefanav, and they're all eating and drinking, right? They're making this big celebration. Vayomru yechi hamelech Adoniyahu. You may remember that this didn't yet happen in the original story. Nobody yet proclaimed king and said, long live King Adoniyahu. But Natan HaNavi is presenting it as a done deal. Everybody, all these people have proclaimed Adoniyahu king. And it is because you, apparently, David, had commanded this. And he continues and says, Veli, ani avdecha, me, I, your servant, and Tzadok Kohen, right, this Kohen, and Bneiyahu ben Yehoyada, who's the military person on his faction, Vili Shlomo avdecha lo kara. Okay, these are the people who are being excluded from this coronation party. And he's saying like this, if all this is happening because of your command, v'lo hodata et avdecha mi yishev al kisei adoni hamelech achara, and you just didn't tell me, your servant, who you intended to replace you on the throne. This sounds like an if, right? If so-and-so, then there's no then, but the implied then is that, then what am I going to say? Okay, that's what it is, right? He's not bringing the then. He's leaving it kind of hanging in the air. if this is what you want, I mean, if this is what you said, okay, and that all this, I think, kind of not only invites, but as I said, backs David into a corner. He's going to have to respond to this. He's going to this is not like David Bathsheba, who came and just said, well, here are the facts. Natan is coming with a much harsher confrontation that says, listen, either this is your doing or it isn't your doing. If it is your doing, okay, it's your doing. If it isn't your doing, you may want to, stand up and do something about that.
It kind of makes him sound very tricky when in the beginning, it sounded like he told Bathsheba that he would be there also, like behind her, supporting her.
Remember that
And
this is the same Navi who came up with Mashal Kivsat Harash to trick David into admitting his guilt.
Okay.
Okay, Navi has to reach his end goal.
And each Navi is different, and I guess this is his way.
This may be his way. Maybe he
Okay.
knows David well enough to know that the only way to be able to manipulate David, and he's absolutely manipulating him, is to back him into a corner like this. But it works.
Okay.
Vayan hamelech David vayomer kir'u li levatshava. Okay, now David is gaining his wits. Okay, and the first thing he says, call Bathsheba. This kir'u li, right? Maybe makes then a contrast to who Adoniyahu called. Adoniyahu called all these people, right? Vaikra to all these people, and to these people lo kara, right? So what Adoniyahu is doing is based on who he's calling, like who he's gathering around him, and David is responding with call Bathsheba.
That Bathsheba was there.
Well, this implies that she wasn't, right? This implies that when they announced Natan Navi, vayavo lifnei hamelach, she must have gone out. In the original plan, right? It doesn't say that she went out. In the original plan, Natan says, "You'll stand there, and I'm going to come." The fact that right now he has to recall in Bathsheba implies that when Natan was saying his whole speech, Bathsheba had left the room. Okay, which may perhaps take his guilt toward Bathsheba, or theoretical guilt toward Bathsheba, out of the picture. Right now, he's just talking to Natan, and Natan's not saying anything about the oath to Bathsheba. He's just presenting it as, well, this is your decision. Is this what you decided? So he's calling back Bathsheba, and he's telling Vayishava Hamelach, and he's reiterating his oath to her. Vayomer Chai Hashem Asher Padai Nafshi Mikol Tzara. Once again, taking an oath in God's name. Ki ka'asher nishbati lach b'Hashem Elohei Yisrael, as I have sworn to you, in the name of God. Again, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but he's certainly taking responsibility for this oath now. Lemor ki Shlomo v'nech yimloch acharai v'hu yishev al kisi tachti. I had sworn to you in God's name that your son Shlomo is going to be king after me, and he's going to sit on my throne. Ki ken e'aseh hayom hazeh. I will do so, I'll make sure it happens on this very day. V'tikod Bathsheba apayim artz, v'tishtachu lamelech, v'tomer yechi Adoni hamelech David la'olam. Long live the king. Once again, all this is happening without Shlomo anywhere in this picture, which means that while Adoniyahu is trying to forcefully take over by coup, right? What's happening with Shlomo is a legitimate transfer of power, right? This is not Shlomo saying, I want to be king, or you promised my mother, or something like that. Shlomo is not even in this picture. David swears to transfer the kingship to Shlomo on his own. Vayomer David, right? If he's continuing with his likro, right, with his coalition. Kir'u li letzadok hakohen u'lenatan hanavi u'lebnayahu ben Yehoyada. You may say, well, Natan Hanavi was standing there. I don't know. Either he was not and came back, or he was standing there, and this is more of a proclamation, okay, of this is the people who I trust and who are on my side. Vayavo lifnei hamelech. Vayomer hamelech lahem, and now he's commanding. All of a sudden, David becomes active and proactive, and he's no longer the passive, things are happening to him, and he's old and infirm. Now he's once again acting as a king. And he says, "Chui machem et avdei adonechem." Take servants with you. Veherkavtem et Shlomo bni ala preda asher li. And once again, we have perhaps the Megillat Esther, right? The Mordechai being on the king's horse, right, is a proclamation that the king agrees to this, right? As although nobody's allowed to ride the king's horse. A preda asher li is my personal steed, right? So make Shlomo, put Shlomo on my personal royal steed. Horadetem oto el Gichon, and take him down to the Gichon. Gichon is the water source within Yerushalayim. So if we have Adoniyahu doing his thing at a water source outside of Yerushalayim, Shlomo is going to be coronated inside Yerushalayim, which is obviously the more legitimate and mamlachti, right? The royal thing is within the royal city as opposed to somewhere out there where nobody sees. Umashach oto sham tzadok kohen. You're going to have the religious leadership anoint him. Natana Navi, there's going to be a Navi there, which Adoniyahu does not have, and they're going to anoint him Melach al Yisrael. Utkatem b'shofar, and you should publicize this by announcing it, right, with a shofar. Va'amartem yechi hamelach Shlomo, and you should proclaim Shlomo king. Va'alitem acharav, and you should all come after him. Again, this shows legitimacy. Vayashav al kisi, and he will sit on my throne. V'hu yimloch tachtai, and he will be king after me. And he is the one who I'm appointing to be the next king over Israel and over Yehuda. Sorry?
Is the key difference that we're meant to be noticing that the religious leaders are the ones who are appointing him? Because I'm just thinking as a stam Jew who's just, seeing, oh, Adoniyahu was just anointed, oh, Shlomo was just anointed.
Mm-hmm.
It would feel actually that maybe Dafka Shlomo's was less legitimate when it's because it's coming second. And sometimes when something like happens, when someone gets in there next, you're like, okay, calm down. Like now this is just a competitive thing, and it's not and you didn't get there first. So sometimes it does have that. But is the difference that we're meant to be noting that, because had David gone, then it would have felt like, oh, okay, the king is present here. Clearly, this is the one that we're supposed to be siding with. But is the fact that the religious leadership was there meant to be the piece that we're picking up on?
I think a few things. I think also the fact that the religious leadership was there. Also the fact that you had a Navi. Also the fact that it was within Yerushalayim and not without Yerushalayim, right? Which is, that makes it more real. Also the fact that you had the king, who is the only one currently who is allowed to decide before his death who's going to be the next king, right? After he dies, I think maybe it's a free-for-all, I don't know, but before he dies, he's the king. He's the number one authority in the land, and he's the one who's saying this. And he's giving him all of the royal stuff, right? He's right on my right? All the Keter Malchut B'Rosho. He's giving him all the royal insignia. And also, if you remember, Adoniyahu was not actually proclaimed king yet, right? The way they presented it to David, I don't know who would make a difference. Like even if he was proclaimed king, I don't know if it would have made a difference to say, well, actually, now he's the second one. But just since you brought that up, Adoniyahu was never proclaimed king. He was proclaimed king only in David and Bathsheba's accounts in Natan and Bathsheba's account to David to try to get him to move along. Adoniyahu had all these set up, right? But he had not actually done it. Again, I don't think that makes a difference. Okay, what makes a difference is he did something that was illegitimate, right? It was outside of Yerushalayim. It was with a breakaway faction. It was, in the king's lifetime without the king's permission. Whereas here you have it based on an oath taken in God's name by the king with all the royal insignia in Yerushalayim with religious and prophetic leadership. I think that should convince us that it's more legitimate. And when we see this next week, we'll see that the people actually bought this and they were all for Shlomo. Okay. Great. Have a great till I see you again.